What happens when salvation becomes a sentence? In 1892, a young enslaved woman's gift for healing would challenge everything the masters believed about power, medicine, and control. But some miracles come with a price too dangerous to pay. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell. This story will change how you see history forever. The summer of 1892 hung heavy over Ruby Holt like a suffocating blanket, the kind that made even the strongest men wilt under its merciless heat. In this small Georgia town, where cotton fields stretched endlessly toward the horizon and the social order seemed as permanent as the red clay beneath their feet, something extraordinary was happening in the shadows of the Whitmore plantation. Her name was Seraphina, though the masters simply called her the girl, or that one with the strange eyes. At 19, she possessed an otherworldly beauty that made people uncomfortable, skin the color of warm honey, hair that caught sunlight like spun silk, and most unsettling of all, eyes the exact shade of hazelnuts that seemed to see straight through to a person's soul. But it wasn't her beauty that made the plantation owners whisper her name in hushed, reverent tones. It was her hands. The gift had manifested when she was barely 12 years old. Her grandmother, Mama Celia, had been the plantation's healer before her, a woman whose knowledge of herbs and remedies was legendary throughout the county. But even Mama Celia had been amazed when young Seraphina's touch had brought a stillborn calf back to life, its tiny chest rising and falling with renewed breath as the child's hands glowed with an inexplicable warmth. "Child got the sight," Mama Celia had whispered to the other women that night, her weathered face creased with worry and wonder. "But the sight comes with a price, always does." Seraphina had learned her craft in the hidden corners of the plantation, in the spaces between sunset and dawn, where the enslaved could speak freely of things the masters would never understand. Mama Celia had taught her which roots could break a fever, which leaves could stop bleeding, which flowers could ease the pain of childbirth. But more than that, she had taught her to listen, to the whispers of the wind through the cotton, to the songs of the birds at dawn, to the ancient voices that spoke through the rustling of leaves. "The earth remembers everything," Mama Celia would say as they gathered herbs in the pre-dawn darkness. "Every tear that's fallen, every prayer that's been whispered, every soul that's passed through. You learn to listen to them memories, child, and they'll teach you things no book ever could." "Massa Whitmore's burning up with fever again," whispered old Martha, the head cook, as she found Seraphina tending to the herb garden behind the slave quarters. "Been 3 days now. Doc Patterson done tried everything, bloodletting, mercury, even them fancy pills from Atlanta. Nothing's working." Seraphina's hazel eyes lifted from the chamomile she was harvesting, her expression unreadable. She had learned long ago to keep her thoughts hidden, to move through the world like a ghost, present but invisible, helpful but never threatening. The art of invisibility was perhaps the most crucial skill any enslaved person could master, and Seraphina had perfected it to an almost supernatural degree. "They asking for you again?" Martha continued, her voice dropping even lower. "Mrs. Whitmore, she's beside herself, says you the only one who can help." This wasn't the first time. Over the past 2 years, Seraphina had been called to the bedsides of dying masters throughout Ruby Holt. Each time, she would arrive with her small leather pouch of herbs, her gentle hands, and her mysterious knowledge that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. The pouch itself was a relic from her grandmother, made from the hide of a deer that had died naturally in the woods, blessed by Mama Celia, with prayers in a language that predated the arrival of white men in Georgia. Inside the pouch were not just herbs, but small tokens of power. A piece of iron from the first nail driven into the plantation's main house, a stone from the creek where her great-grandmother had been baptized, a fragment of bone from an ancestor whose name had been lost to time but whose spirit still guided her hands. These were the true sources of her power, though she would never speak of them to the white folks who benefited from her gift. The walk to the main house felt longer than usual that evening. The grand white columns of the Whitmore mansion loomed against the darkening sky, their shadows stretching across the manicured lawn like grasping fingers. Seraphina had been born on this plantation, had spent every day of her 19 years within its boundaries, yet she still felt like an intruder every time she climbed those polished wooden steps. The house itself was a monument to wealth built on suffering, its marble floors polished by enslaved hands, its crystal chandeliers cleaned by women who would never own anything so beautiful. It's mahogany furniture crafted by men whose own children slept on dirt floors. Every luxury within those walls had been paid for with blood and sweat and tears, a fact that Serafina felt in her bones every time she crossed the threshold. "Thank God you're here," breathed Eleanor Whitmore, her usually pristine appearance disheveled with worry. Dark circles rimmed her blue eyes, and her greying hair had escaped its careful pins. He's so much worse, the doctor says." She couldn't finish the sentence. Eleanor Whitmore was a woman caught between worlds, raised to believe in her own superiority, yet dependent on the very people she was taught to consider inferior. She had never questioned the system that gave her comfort and status, but in moments like these, when her husband's life hung in the balance, the artificial barriers between black and white seemed as fragile as morning mist. Serafina nodded silently and followed Eleanor up the grand staircase, her bare feet making no sound on the thick carpet. The master bedroom was stifling, heavy with the smell of sickness and fear. Thick curtains blocked out the evening air, and multiple oil lamps cast dancing shadows on the walls. The room was a shrine to masculine power, dark wood furniture, leather-bound books, hunting trophies mounted on the walls, but all of it seemed diminished by the presence of death lurking in the corners. James Whitmore lay motionless in the center of the massive four-poster bed, his face flushed with fever, his breathing shallow and labored. At 52, he had always been a robust man, quick to anger and quicker to use his fists. Now he looked fragile, almost childlike, consumed by whatever illness had taken hold of him. His hands, which had signed bills of sale for human beings and wielded whips with casual cruelty, now lay limp and powerless at his sides. "The fever won't break, Doctor," Patterson said, approaching Serafina with obvious reluctance. He was a thin, nervous man who had never quite accepted that his medical training from the University of Georgia was often less effective than this young woman's folk remedies. "I've tried everything in my arsenal." Dr. Patterson represented the new world of scientific medicine, with its emphasis on education and empirical evidence. Yet he had been forced to acknowledge again and again that Serafina's intuitive understanding of healing often surpassed his own knowledge. It was a humbling reality that challenged everything he had been taught about the superiority of formal education over traditional wisdom. Serafina moved to the bedside with fluid grace, her hands already reaching for the small leather pouch at her waist. She had learned her craft from her grandmother, Mama Celia, who had learned it from her grandmother before her. Knowledge passed down through generations of women who understood that healing was both art and intuition. This was medicine, as it had been practiced for thousands of years, before it became the exclusive domain of men with degrees and diplomas. From her pouch, she withdrew dried willow bark, feverfew, and elderflower. Her movements were precise, almost ritualistic, as she prepared the infusion, but it wasn't just the herbs that made her treatments effective. It was something in her touch, a warmth that seemed to flow from her fingertips, a connection that went deeper than medicine. She could feel the illness as if it were a living thing, could sense its patterns and weaknesses, could find the precise combination of plant medicine and spiritual energy needed to drive it from the body. "Please," Eleanor whispered, clutching her husband's limp hand. "Please save him." Serafina met her eyes for just a moment, seeing the desperation there, the fear of a woman who knew that her entire world depended on this man's survival. In the complex hierarchy of the antebellum South, a widow's position was precarious at best, and Eleanor Whitmore had no sons to inherit the plantation. Without James, she would be at the mercy of his relatives, her comfortable life potentially stripped away in an instant. Working in silence, Serafina administered the herbal tea drop by drop, her fingers gentle against James Whitmore's burning forehead. She could feel the fever raging through his body like a wildfire, consuming everything in its path. But she could also feel something else, a darkness that went beyond physical illness, a weight that pressed down on his spirit like a stone. It was the accumulated guilt of a lifetime spent in cruelty, the spiritual poison that came from treating other human beings as property. This was the part of healing that Mama Celia had warned her about, the way that illness often reflected the condition of the soul, the way that physical symptoms could be manifestations of spiritual sickness. To truly heal someone, Serafina often had to touch not just their body, but their deepest shame and pain. It was a burden that grew heavier with each patient she treated. Hours passed. Eleanor dozed fitfully in a chair beside the bed, while Dr. Patterson paced nervously by the window. Serafina remained motionless, her hands resting lightly on the sick man's chest, her eyes closed in concentration. She could feel his life force flickering like a candle in the wind, could sense the moment when his spirit began to separate from his body, preparing for the journey to whatever lay beyond. But she also felt the pull of all those who depended on him, not just Eleanor, but the dozens of enslaved people whose lives would be thrown into chaos if he died. Plantations without masters often meant families torn apart, children sold away from parents, elderly people cast out to die. The cruel irony was that sometimes the survival of the oppressor was necessary for the survival of the oppressed. It was near dawn when the fever finally broke. James Whitmore's eyes fluttered open, clear and lucid for the first time in days. Color returned to his cheeks, and his breathing deepened and steadied. Eleanor woke with a start, gasping when she saw her husband looking back at her. "James, oh James!" She threw herself across the bed, tears streaming down her face. Dr. Patterson stared in amazement, checking and rechecking his patient's pulse and temperature. "Remarkable," he muttered. "Absolutely remarkable. The fever's completely gone." But Serafina was already gathering her things, preparing to slip away as quietly as she had come. She had learned that gratitude from white folks was often short-lived and sometimes dangerous. Better to disappear before questions could be asked, before the miracle could be examined too closely and found wanting. "Wait." James Whitmore's voice was weak but clear. "Girl, what's your name?" She paused at the doorway, her hazel eyes meeting his for the first time. In that moment, she saw not the master who had the power of life and death over her, but simply a man who had been pulled back from the brink of eternity. "Serafina, sir." "Serafina." He repeated the name as if tasting it. "You saved my life." She said nothing, but something passed between them in that moment, an understanding that would prove more dangerous than either of them could imagine. For the first time, James Whitmore was seeing her not as property, but as a person. And for Serafina, that recognition was both a gift and a curse. As Serafina walked back to the slave quarters in the pale morning light, she didn't notice the figure watching from an upstairs window. Thomas Whitmore, James's younger brother, had arrived during the night and witnessed the entire healing. His dark eyes followed her retreating form with an expression that mixed fascination with something far more troubling. Thomas was a different breed of white man than his brother, educated, curious, and dangerously intelligent. Where James ruled through brute force and intimidation, Thomas preferred to understand and manipulate. He had studied law and medicine in Charleston, had read books on natural philosophy and scientific method, and what he had witnessed in that sick room challenged everything he thought he knew about the natural world. The gift that had saved so many lives was about to become a curse that would change everything. Word of James Whitmore's miraculous recovery spread through Ruby Holt like wildfire through dry grass. Within days, Serafina found herself summoned to plantations throughout the county, her reputation growing with each impossible cure. But with fame came scrutiny, and with scrutiny came danger. The pattern was always the same: a desperate family, a dying loved one, and the quiet young woman with the hazel eyes who arrived carrying nothing but a leather pouch and an inexplicable gift. She would work in silence, her hands moving with practiced precision, her presence bringing a calm that seemed to settle over even the most chaotic sick room. There was Judge Morrison's wife, dying of consumption, who rose from her deathbed after 3 days of Serafina's care. The woman had been wasting away for months, her lungs slowly drowning in their own fluid, her family already making funeral arrangements. But Serafina had sat with her through 3 long nights, her hands pressed against the woman's chest, drawing out the infection breath by breath until the lungs cleared and the fever broke. Colonel Bradley's son, struck down by typhoid, who walked again after a week of herbal treatments and those mysterious healing hands. The boy had been delirious for days, his body racked with fever and convulsions, his parents watching helplessly as their only heir slipped away. Serafina had arrived like an angel of mercy, her touch cooling the fever, her presence calming the storm that raged within his young body. Each success only added to the legend, and with it, the danger. In the post-war South, where the old order had been shattered but not replaced, where former slaves walked free but still lived in fear, a young black woman with seemingly supernatural powers was walking a tightrope over an abyss of suspicion and jealousy. "You need to be careful, child," old Martha warned one evening as they sat shelling peas on the porch of the slave quarters. The old woman's fingers moved with practiced efficiency, but her eyes were troubled. "White folks getting mighty curious about what you do up there in them big houses." Martha had lived through slavery, the war, and the uncertain years that followed. She had seen what happened to black people who attracted too much attention, who made white folks uncomfortable with their abilities or their independence. The stories were whispered in the quarters, of healers accused of witchcraft, of preachers charged with inciting rebellion, of anyone who dared to rise above their assigned place in the social order. Serafina's fingers never paused in their work, but her hazel eyes grew distant. "I only do what Mama Celia taught me, herbs and prayer, nothing more." But even as she spoke the words, Serafina knew they weren't entirely true. What she did went beyond herbs and prayer, beyond anything that could be explained by conventional medicine or traditional faith. She could feel the life force flowing through her patients, could sense the exact moment when death began its approach, could somehow redirect that energy and pull souls back from the brink of eternity. Martha's weathered face creased with worry. "Your grandmother, God rest her soul, she knew things, but she also knew when to keep quiet about 'em. These are dangerous times for folks like us, especially ones who can do what you do." The old woman was right to be concerned. In the aftermath of the Civil War and Reconstruction, the South was a powder keg of resentment and fear. The old order had been shattered, but its ghost still haunted every interaction between black and white. Former slaves were technically free, but freedom without economic power or political protection was a fragile thing, easily revoked by those who still held the real authority. A young enslaved woman who could seemingly work miracles was walking a tightrope over an abyss of suspicion and jealousy. Her very existence challenged the fundamental assumptions of white supremacy. If a black woman could possess such extraordinary abilities, what did that say about the supposed natural order that placed whites above blacks in the hierarchy of creation? But Serafina couldn't stop. Each time she was called to a sickbed, she saw not the color of the patient's skin or their position in society, but simply a human being in need. It was a compassion that her grandmother had warned her about, a dangerous softness in a world that demanded hardness for survival. The trouble began 3 weeks after James Whitmore's recovery, when Serafina was called to treat a young woman named Rebecca, one of the house slaves at the Morrison plantation. Rebecca had been suffering from a mysterious wasting disease that had baffled Dr. Patterson and the other physicians in the area. She was barely 18, with skin like polished ebony and eyes that held depths of sorrow that spoke of unspeakable experiences. When Serafina arrived at the Morrison house, she found Rebecca lying in a small room behind the kitchen, her body so thin that her bones showed through her skin like the framework of a building. But it wasn't just physical illness that was consuming the young woman. Serafina could sense a deeper wound, a spiritual injury that went to the very core of her being. What happened to her? Serafina asked Martha, who had accompanied her to the Morrison plantation. Martha's face darkened. "Judge Morrison's son," she said quietly. "Been using her for his pleasure since she turned 16. Girl tried to fight him off last month and he hurt her bad, been wasting away ever since." The story was all too familiar. Young black women had no protection from the sexual predations of white men, no recourse when they were violated, no justice when they were brutalized. Rebecca's illness was as much a product of trauma as it was of any physical ailment, her body shutting down in response to wounds that went deeper than flesh and bone. Serafina worked with Rebecca for 3 days, using not just herbs and healing touch, but something more, a kind of spiritual communion that allowed her to absorb some of the young woman's pain into herself. It was dangerous work. the kind that left Serafina drained and hollow, but gradually Rebecca began to recover. On the third night, as Rebecca slept peacefully for the first time in weeks, she began to speak in her dreams. Her voice was clear and strong, and she spoke of things that had happened in the Morrison house: secret meetings, hidden documents, whispered conversations about money and politics that no slave should have known about. Thomas Whitmore had been watching Serafina carefully, studying her methods, trying to understand the source of her power. Unlike his older brother, Thomas was educated. Having spent several years in Charleston studying law and medicine, he prided himself on being a man of science, skeptical of superstition and folk remedies. Yet he couldn't deny what he had witnessed. And when word reached him of Rebecca's strange revelations during her healing, his interest became something more dangerous, suspicion mixed with opportunity. "There's something unnatural about that girl," he confided to Dr. Patterson over brandy in the Whitmore study. The room was lined with law books and medical texts, symbols of Thomas's education and sophistication. No combination of herbs should be able to cure what she's cured. There has to be another explanation. Dr. Patterson shifted uncomfortably in his leather chair. Despite his gratitude for his own healing, he was beginning to feel uneasy about Serafina's methods. "Perhaps we simply don't understand all the properties of the plants she uses. There's still much about medicine that remains mysterious." "Or perhaps," Thomas said, his voice dropping to a whisper, "she's using methods that have nothing to do with medicine at all. Did you hear what the Morrison girl said while she was recovering? She spoke of private conversations, of documents she couldn't possibly have seen. How could she know such things unless—" The implication hung in the air between them like smoke. In the superstitious atmosphere of the post-war South, accusations of witchcraft or voodoo could be deadly, especially for a young black woman with no protection beyond her usefulness to the white community. Thomas had been taking careful notes of every healing, documenting the methods and the outcomes, building a case that he could use when the time was right. He understood that Serafina's power made her valuable, but it also made her dangerous. And dangerous things, in Thomas Whitmore's experience, needed to be controlled or eliminated. Meanwhile, Serafina continued her work, unaware of the storm gathering around her. She had been called to the Pemberton plantation, where the master's elderly father lay dying of what appeared to be his final illness. The old man had been a pillar of the community, a veteran of the Mexican War, and a founding member of the local church. Samuel Pemberton was a different kind of white man than most Serafina had encountered. He had fought against slavery in his younger days, had freed his own slaves before the war, and had spent his later years trying to make amends for the sins of his past. His illness seemed to be as much spiritual as physical, a deep weariness that came from carrying the weight of a lifetime's worth of guilt and regret. The Pemberton house was smaller than the Whitmore mansion, but no less imposing, with its wraparound porch and towering oak trees draped in Spanish moss. The air was thick with the scent of magnolia blossoms and the sound of cicadas, creating an atmosphere that was both beautiful and melancholy. Serafina was led to a back bedroom where Samuel Pemberton lay surrounded by his grieving family. The room was simple but comfortable, filled with books and photographs that spoke of a life lived with purpose and meaning. "He's been asking for you," whispered Margaret Pemberton, the old man's daughter-in-law. "Heard about what you did for James Whitmore. Please, if there's anything you can do." Serafina approached the bed with her usual quiet grace. Samuel Pemberton was ancient by the standards of the time, his white hair thin and wispy, his skin like parchment. But his eyes were still sharp, still aware, and they fixed on her with surprising intensity. "So you're the miracle worker," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Come closer, child." She knelt beside the bed, her hands already moving to prepare her herbs, but the old man caught her wrist with surprising strength. "I'm dying," he said simply. "We both know it. But before I go, I want to understand. How do you do it? What gives you this power?" Serafina met his gaze steadily. "I don't know, sir. I only know that sometimes when I touch someone who's sick, I can feel their pain, and sometimes I can help take it away." "Feel their pain," he repeated thoughtfully. "Yes, I can see it in your eyes. You carry all of it, don't you? Every person you've healed, you've taken a piece of their suffering into yourself. It was true, though she had never spoken of it to anyone. Each healing left her drained, not just physically but emotionally. She carried the weight of every fever she had broken, every infection she had fought, every moment of agony she had eased. It was a burden that grew heavier with each passing day, a price that she paid willingly but that was slowly consuming her from within. "That's a terrible gift, child," Samuel Pemberton said softly, "and a dangerous one. There are those who would see it as something evil, something to be feared rather than celebrated." As if summoned by his words, Thomas Whitmore appeared in the doorway. He had been visiting the Pembertons when word came of Seraphina's arrival, and he had been waiting for this opportunity to observe her more closely. "How is he?" Thomas asked, though his eyes never left Seraphina. "Resting more comfortably," Margaret replied. "Seraphina's treatment seemed to be helping." Thomas moved closer to the bed, his gaze intense and calculating. "I'd like to observe the treatment if I may. For medical purposes, you understand." Seraphina felt a chill run down her spine. There was something in Thomas Whitmore's manner that reminded her of a cat watching a mouse, patient and predatory, but she couldn't refuse without causing suspicion. For the next hour, Thomas watched every move she made, every herb she selected, every gentle touch she administered. He took notes in a small leather journal, documenting everything with scientific precision. His presence changed the atmosphere in the room, adding a tension that made the healing more difficult, more draining. It was when she placed her hands on Samuel Pemberton's chest, feeling for the rhythm of his labored breathing, that something unexpected happened. The old man's eyes suddenly widened and he gripped her wrist again. "I see her," he whispered, his voice filled with wonder. "I see my Sarah. She's waiting for me." Seraphina felt it too, a presence in the room, warm and loving, calling to the dying man. It wasn't the first time she had sensed such things during her healings, but she had learned to keep these experiences to herself. The boundary between life and death was thinner than most people realized, and sometimes, in the process of healing, she caught glimpses of what lay beyond. Thomas Whitmore saw the look that passed between them, saw the way Seraphina's eyes seemed to focus on something beyond the physical world. His pen scratched furiously across the paper as he recorded every detail. Samuel Pemberton died peacefully an hour later, a smile on his weathered face. His family wept, but they were grateful that his passing had been gentle, free from the pain that had racked his final days. As Seraphina gathered her things to leave, Thomas approached her. "That was remarkable," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "The way you seemed to communicate with him at the end, almost as if you could see what he was seeing." Seraphina's blood turned to ice. "I don't know what you mean, sir." "Don't you?" Thomas smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "I think you know exactly what I mean, and I think it's time we had a longer conversation about your methods." As she walked home through the gathering dusk, Seraphina felt the weight of Thomas Whitmore's suspicion following her like a shadow. The gift that had brought her respect and purpose was becoming a trap, and she could feel the walls closing in around her. In the distance, thunder rumbled across the Georgia sky, promising a storm that would wash away more than just the dust of the day. Change was coming to Ruby Holt, and Seraphina was about to discover that some prices are too high to pay, even for the power to heal. The whispers in the shadows were growing louder, and soon they would become shouts that would echo through the streets of Ruby Holt, demanding answers that Seraphina might not be able to give. The storm that had been brewing finally broke on a sweltering August evening, but it wasn't the thunder and lightning that would change everything. It was the arrival of a stranger who would test Seraphina's gift in ways she never imagined. Reverend Ezekiel Marsh rode into Ruby Holt on a black horse, his severe face and piercing grey eyes marking him as a man who saw the world in stark terms of good and evil. He had come from Charleston at the request of several prominent families, drawn by disturbing reports of unnatural healings and suspicious practices among the local enslaved population. The Reverend was a man of imposing presence, tall and gaunt, with prematurely white hair that he wore long in the style of an Old Testament prophet. His black coat was always immaculate, his Bible always at hand, and his voice carried the authority of someone who believed himself to be God's instrument on earth. He had made his reputation throughout the South as a hunter of heretics, a man who could sniff out corruption and evil wherever it might hide. "We live in dangerous times," he proclaimed from the pulpit of Ruby Holt's First Baptist Church that Sunday morning. The church was packed, every pew filled with white faces turned toward him in rapt attention. Satan walks among us, disguised as an angel of light, performing false miracles to lead the faithful astray. We must be vigilant against those who would use dark arts to deceive us. His sermon was a masterpiece of religious theater, his voice rising and falling with practiced rhythm, his gestures sweeping and dramatic. He spoke of biblical plagues and divine judgment, of false prophets and the corruption that came from trafficking with demons. And though he never mentioned Seraphina by name, everyone in the congregation knew exactly who he was talking about. Thomas Whitmore sat in the front pew, nodding approvingly at every word. He had been the one to write to Reverend Marsh, sharing his detailed observations of Seraphina's methods and his growing suspicions about their true nature. The letter had been carefully crafted, presenting just enough evidence to intrigue the Reverend without making any direct accusations that could be easily disproven. "I have witnessed things," Thomas had written, "that challenge the very foundations of Christian belief. A young Negro woman who claims to heal through natural means, yet whose methods suggest a deeper, more troubling source of power. She speaks with the dying as if she can see into the spirit world, and those she treats often reveal knowledge they could not possibly possess. I fear we may be dealing with something far more dangerous than simple folk medicine." The letter had arrived at exactly the right time. Reverend Marsh had been looking for a new crusade, a fresh opportunity to demonstrate his zeal and secure his reputation. The idea of a black woman practicing what might be witchcraft in the heart of Georgia was exactly the kind of challenge that appealed to his sense of divine mission. Meanwhile, Seraphina knelt in the small chapel of the slave quarters, unaware that her world was about to crumble. She had been praying more frequently lately, seeking guidance for the growing burden she carried. Each healing seemed to take more from her, leaving her drained and hollow, as if pieces of her soul were being traded for the lives she saved. The chapel was a simple structure, built by the enslaved community, with their own hands and their own meager resources. It had no stained glass windows or carved altars, just rough wooden benches and a simple cross made from 2 pieces of driftwood. But it was a sacred space nonetheless, filled with the prayers and hopes of people who had little else to sustain them. "Child, you look like death warmed over," old Martha observed, finding Seraphina still on her knees as the morning sun streamed through the chapel's single window. "When's the last time you ate a proper meal?" Seraphina rose slowly, her movement stiff and weary. The healing work was taking an increasingly visible toll on her body. Her clothes hung loose on her frame, her cheeks were hollow, and her hazel eyes seemed to have sunk deeper into her skull. "I'm fine, Martha. Just tired." "Tired?" Martha's weathered hands cupped Seraphina's face, studying the dark circles under her hazel eyes, the hollow of her cheeks. "You're wasting away, girl. This gift of yours, it's killing you by inches." It was true, though Seraphina had been trying to hide it from everyone, including herself. Each healing required her to open herself completely to her patient's suffering, to take their pain into her own body and spirit. Over time, the accumulated weight of all that absorbed agony was crushing her, wearing away at her life force like water wearing away stone. Before Seraphina could respond, a commotion outside drew their attention. A rider was approaching at full gallop, dust flying from his horse's hooves. It was young Billy Patterson, the doctor's son, his face flushed with panic and streaked with tears. "Seraphina!" he called out, sliding from his horse before it had fully stopped. "You got to come quick. It's my pa. He's been hurt bad." The story came out in gasps as they hurried toward town. Dr. Patterson had been thrown from his horse while making rounds, striking his head on a rock. He had been unconscious for hours, and his condition was deteriorating rapidly. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The man who had often questioned Seraphina's methods was now depending on them for his life. "Ma's beside herself," Billy continued, tears streaming down his young face. "She says if anyone can help him, it's you. Please, Seraphina. He's all we got." The boy's desperation was heartbreaking. Dr. Patterson might have been skeptical of Seraphina's abilities, but he had always treated her with more respect than most white men showed to black women. He had never been cruel or dismissive, and his son clearly adored him. The Patterson house was modest compared to the grand plantations, but it was filled with the same desperate energy that Serafina had come to know so well. Mrs. Patterson, a small bird-like woman, clutched Serafina's hands the moment she arrived. "Thank God you're here," she sobbed. "He won't wake up. There's blood. So much blood." Dr. Patterson lay motionless on his own examination table, his medical instruments scattered around him like abandoned tools. A deep gash on his temple had been roughly bandaged, but blood continued to seep through the cloth. His breathing was shallow and irregular, and his skin had taken on a grayish pallor that Serafina recognized as the shadow of approaching death. The room smelled of carbolic acid and fear, the sharp scent of medical supplies mixing with the metallic odor of blood. Serafina had been in this room before, watching Dr. Patterson work on other patients, observing his methods and comparing them to her own. Now the roles were reversed, and she was the one fighting to save a life. She worked quickly, her hands moving with practiced efficiency as she cleaned the wound and applied a poultice of comfrey and yarrow. But this injury was different from the fevers and infections she usually treated. The damage was internal, hidden, and she could feel the darkness spreading through his brain like spilled ink. The skull fracture was severe, and there was swelling that was putting pressure on the delicate tissues of the brain. In her mind's eye, Serafina could see the injury as clearly as if she were looking at an anatomical drawing. The cracked bone, the torn blood vessels, the bruised and swollen brain tissue that was slowly shutting down the functions that kept Dr. Patterson alive. "I need quiet," she said softly. And Mrs. Patterson ushered everyone from the room except for Billy, who refused to leave his father's side. Serafina placed her hands on Dr. Patterson's head, closing her eyes and reaching out with senses that had no name. She could feel the swelling in his brain, the pressure building like water behind a dam. If she could somehow reduce that pressure, draw out the inflammation. The healing that followed was unlike anything she had ever attempted. She felt herself sinking deeper into the connection, pouring more of her own life force into the effort to save him. The room around her seemed to fade away, leaving only the rhythm of two heartbeats, his growing stronger, hers growing weaker. She could feel the damaged blood vessels in his brain, could sense the exact locations where the bleeding needed to stop. With infinite care, she began to redirect the flow of blood, using her own life energy to seal the tears and reduce the swelling. It was delicate work, requiring a level of precision that pushed her abilities to their absolute limit. As she worked, Serafina became aware of a presence beside her, the spirit of her grandmother, Mama Celia, offering guidance and strength. The old woman's voice whispered in her ear, sharing knowledge that had been passed down through generations of healers. "Easy, child," Mama Celia's spirit seemed to say. "Feel the rhythm of his life. Match it with your own. But don't give too much or you'll have nothing left for yourself." But Serafina was beyond caution now. Dr. Patterson was dying, and his son was watching with desperate hope in his young eyes. She opened herself completely, allowing the full force of her healing power to flow into the injured man. When Dr. Patterson's eyes finally opened, clear and focused, Serafina collapsed. "Pa!" Billy cried out, throwing himself into his father's arms. Dr. Patterson sat up slowly, his hand going to his head in amazement. The wound was still there, but the bleeding had stopped, and the crushing pain that had consumed him was gone. He looked around the room in confusion until his gaze fell on Serafina's still form. "What happened to her?" he asked, struggling to his feet. Billy knelt beside Serafina, his young face pale with fear. "She just fell down after you woke up. She ain't moving, Pa." "Doctor." Patterson's medical training took over as he examined Serafina. Her pulse was weak and thready, her breathing shallow. Her skin was cold to the touch, and there was something else, a grayish pallor that he recognized from his own reflection just moments before. "She's taken it into herself," he whispered in amazement and horror. "Somehow she's taken my injury into her own body." It was at that moment that Thomas Whitmore and Reverend Marsh arrived, drawn by reports of another miraculous healing. They found Dr. Patterson cradling Seraphina's unconscious form, his face filled with wonder and guilt. "What manner of sorcery is this?" Reverend Marsh demanded, his grey eyes blazing with righteous fury. "This girl has clearly made a pact with dark forces." The Reverend's voice filled the small room like thunder, his presence seeming to suck the air from the space. He stood in the doorway like an avenging angel, his black coat billowing around him, his Bible clutched in his white-knuckled fist. "No," Dr. Patterson said firmly, his voice gaining strength. "This is healing in its purest form. She saved my life by sacrificing her own health. There's nothing dark about it." But Thomas Whitmore was already taking notes, documenting every detail of the scene. "Look at her," he said, pointing to Seraphina's pale, still form. "She's taken on the very appearance of death itself. What kind of natural healing could do such a thing?" The argument that followed would echo through Ruby Holt for days to come. Dr. Patterson, grateful for his life, defended Seraphina passionately. But Reverend Marsh and Thomas Whitmore painted a different picture, of a young woman who had made an unholy bargain, trading pieces of her soul for the power to cheat death. "The evidence is clear," Reverend Marsh declared, his voice carrying the authority of absolute certainty. "No mortal being could transfer illness from one body to another without supernatural assistance. This woman has clearly entered into a covenant with the powers of darkness." As word spread through the town, opinions became divided. Some saw Seraphina as a saint, a vessel of divine healing. Others whispered of witchcraft and devil worship. The very gift that had made her invaluable was now making her a target. Seraphina herself remained unconscious for 3 days, hovering between life and death in the small room behind the Patterson house. When she finally awoke, the world had changed around her. The whispers had grown louder, the suspicions deeper, and the protection she had once enjoyed from grateful patience was beginning to crumble. "They're saying terrible things about you," Billy Patterson whispered when he brought her water. "Reverend Marsh is preaching that you're in league with the devil. Some folks are starting to believe him." Seraphina closed her eyes, feeling the weight of exhaustion and something deeper, a bone-deep weariness that came from carrying too much pain, healing too many wounds, sacrificing too much of herself for others. She had always known that her gift came with a price, but she was only now beginning to understand how high that price might be. Outside, storm clouds were gathering again, and this time they would bring more than rain. The day that would change everything was approaching, and Seraphina could feel it in her bones like an old wound aching before a storm. The gift that had defined her life was about to become her greatest curse, and Ruby Holt would never be the same. The day that would shatter Seraphina's world began like any other, with the soft light of dawn filtering through the windows of the slave quarters and the distant sound of roosters crowing across the plantation. But there was a tension in the air, a heaviness that seemed to press down on Ruby Holt like a suffocating blanket. It had been 2 weeks since Dr. Patterson's healing, and the controversy surrounding Seraphina had only grown more intense. Reverend Marsh had been preaching daily sermons about the dangers of false prophets and dark magic, while Thomas Whitmore had been gathering testimonies from anyone willing to speak against her. The Reverend had established himself in the town's finest hotel, holding court each evening with the leading citizens of Ruby Holt. His room had become a center of conspiracy, where fear and superstition were carefully cultivated and directed toward a single target. Maps of the county were spread across his table, marked with the locations of Seraphina's healings, as if tracking the spread of some spiritual contagion. "Look at the pattern," Reverend Marsh would say, pointing to the marks on his map. "Each healing follows the same unnatural progression. The patient recovers completely, but the girl grows weaker. She is clearly drawing power from some external source, and that source can only be demonic." Thomas Whitmore had compiled a detailed dossier of evidence, documenting every healing, every unusual occurrence, every moment when Seraphina had seemed to display knowledge or abilities beyond the natural. His legal training had taught him how to build a case, how to present evidence in a way that would convince even the most skeptical observer. "We have witnesses," Thomas would tell the gathered men, "respected members of the community who have seen her commune with spirits, who have heard her speak of things no mortal should know. The evidence is overwhelming. The breaking point came when young Emily Caldwell, the 7-year-old daughter of a prominent merchant, fell gravely ill with what appeared to be diphtheria. The child's condition deteriorated rapidly, and despite Dr. Patterson's best efforts, she seemed beyond help. Emily was the pride of her family, a bright, beautiful child with golden curls and blue eyes that sparkled with intelligence and mischief. Her father, Marcus Caldwell, owned the largest general store in Ruby Holt and was one of the town's most influential citizens. Her mother, Margaret, was the daughter of a Charleston banking family, a woman of refinement and education who had never expected to face such a crisis in her carefully ordered life. The Caldwell house was one of the finest in Ruby Holt, a 2-story Victorian mansion with gingerbread trim and a wraparound porch. It sat on the town's main street like a monument to prosperity and respectability, its manicured gardens and white picket fence marking it as the home of people who mattered in the community. But now that perfect facade was cracking under the weight of tragedy. Emily had been sick for 3 days, her condition worsening with each passing hour. The membrane in her throat was thickening, making it harder and harder for her to breathe. Her fever was climbing, and her small body was beginning to convulse with the effort of fighting the disease. "Please," Margaret Caldwell begged, falling to her knees before Seraphina in the dusty yard of the slave quarters. "I know what they're saying about you, but I don't care. She's my only child. If there's any chance you can save her." The sight of a wealthy white woman kneeling before a black slave was shocking enough to draw stares from everyone in the quarters. Margaret Caldwell had never spoken to Seraphina before, had probably never even noticed her existence. But desperation had a way of breaking down the barriers that society erected, of reducing all human relationships to their most basic elements. Seraphina looked into the desperate mother's eyes and saw her own reflection, a woman who would sacrifice anything for those she loved. Despite the warnings from old Martha, despite the growing danger to herself, she couldn't turn away from a dying child. "I'll come," she said simply, and Margaret Caldwell sobbed with relief. The Caldwell house was surrounded by a crowd when they arrived. Word had spread quickly that the witch woman had been summoned, and people had gathered to witness what they believed would be either a miracle or a revelation of evil. The atmosphere was electric with tension, fear, and morbid curiosity. Reverend Marsh stood on the front porch, his black coat billowing in the humid breeze, his grey eyes fixed on Seraphina with undisguised hatred. "This child's illness is a test from the Almighty," he declared to the crowd. "To interfere with his will through unnatural means is blasphemy of the highest order." His voice carried across the gathered crowd like the tolling of a funeral bell. He had positioned himself as the guardian of divine will, the protector of the community against supernatural corruption. In his mind, this moment would be the culmination of his crusade, the final proof of Seraphina's evil nature. But Margaret Caldwell pushed past him, leading Seraphina into the house where little Emily lay gasping for breath, her small face blue with oxygen deprivation. The membrane in her throat was closing, and each breath was a struggle that grew weaker with every passing moment. The child's bedroom was a shrine to innocence and privilege. White lace curtains, a canopy bed draped in pink silk, shelves lined with expensive dolls and toys. But all of that luxury meant nothing in the face of death, which cared nothing for wealth or social position. "She's dying," Dr. Patterson said quietly, his face grave. "The disease has progressed too far. I'm sorry, Margaret." Emily Caldwell was beyond the reach of conventional medicine. The diphtheria had created a thick membrane in her throat that was slowly strangling her, while the toxins produced by the bacteria were poisoning her blood. Her small body was fighting a battle it couldn't win, and time was running out. Seraphina knelt beside the small bed, her hazel eyes taking in every detail of the child's condition. Emily was beyond the reach of herbs or conventional medicine. This would require everything she had, and perhaps more than she could give. The room was filled with people, Margaret and Marcus Caldwell, Dr. Patterson, several family friends, and in the corner, Thomas Whitmore with his ever-present notebook. The weight of their expectations pressed down on Seraphina like a physical force. "Everyone out," she said softly. "I need quiet." "No," Thomas Whitmore stepped forward, his notebook in hand. "If you're going to perform your treatments, then they should be witnessed, for the safety of all concerned." Serafina met his gaze steadily. "Then you'll see exactly what I do, nothing more, nothing less." What followed was the most intense healing of Serafina's life. She placed her hands on Emily's chest, feeling the child's labored breathing, the fever burning through her small body, the membrane that was slowly strangling her. But this time, instead of drawing the illness into herself gradually, Serafina made a desperate choice. She could feel the disease like a living thing, a malevolent presence that had wrapped itself around the child's throat and was slowly squeezing the life from her. The membrane was thick and tough, resistant to the body's natural defenses, and the toxins in Emily's blood were spreading like poison through her system. Serafina opened herself completely, allowing Emily's suffering to flow into her like a river bursting through a dam. The pain was immediate and overwhelming. Her own throat began to close, her own lungs struggled for air, her own body burned with fever. But Emily's breathing eased, the blue tinge faded from her lips, and her eyes fluttered open. The transfer was more complete than anything Serafina had ever attempted. She felt the membrane forming in her own throat, felt the toxins flooding her bloodstream, felt her own life force being consumed by the disease she had taken upon herself. It was like drowning in someone else's pain, like being burned alive by someone else's fever. "Mama?" the child whispered, her voice clear and strong. Margaret Caldwell sobbed with relief, gathering her daughter into her arms. The crowd outside erupted in cheers and amazed whispers. Another impossible healing. Another life saved by the mysterious young woman with the hazel eyes. But Serafina was dying. The transfer had been too complete, too sudden. She collapsed beside the bed, her body convulsing as the full force of Emily's illness ravaged her system. Blood frothed from her lips, and her breathing became the same desperate gasping that had marked the child's condition moments before. "She's taken it all," Dr. Patterson breathed in amazement and horror. "The entire disease, she's pulled it completely into herself." Thomas Whitmore scribbled furiously in his notebook, documenting every detail. "This is proof," he declared. "No human being could survive what we've just witnessed. She's clearly made a pact with supernatural forces." Reverend Marsh pushed into the room, his face twisted with righteous fury. "Behold the price of trafficking with demons," he shouted. "She has revealed her true nature at last." But it was what happened next that sealed Serafina's fate. As she lay dying, her consciousness slipping away, something extraordinary occurred. The room filled with a soft golden light that seemed to emanate from Serafina herself. Those present later described seeing figures in the light, shadowy forms that reached out to her with loving hands. The light was unlike anything any of them had ever seen, warm and comforting yet somehow otherworldly. It seemed to pulse with a rhythm that matched Serafina's failing heartbeat, growing brighter as her life force ebbed away. Some in the room felt a profound sense of peace wash over them, while others recoiled in fear from what they perceived as supernatural manifestation. "Mama Celia," Serafina whispered, her voice barely audible. "I see you, grandmother. I see them all." The spirits of every person she had ever healed seemed to gather around her, their gratitude and love flowing back to her in her moment of greatest need. They were all there.